What's up YouTube? So today I want to show you how to use Faceplant's new Granular engine as a loop Mangler, kind of sampler type thing. So the idea here is to be able to load up a loop and completely switch it up, change the sequence and effects to certain bits, and just generally create new inspiration out of tired samples, or that kind of thing. Anyway, let's dive in and have a look. So here I've got a loop of some synth grid one-shot type of sounds that I've created in something else that I'm not going to give away, but I'm just saying it's a thing that I'm working on. So this is a loop that I've just rendered as an audio file, just with a single hit on every 1/8 note. So the idea is we want to load this into Faceplant's Granular engine, not only retain the loopability so that if we change the project's tempo, it's going to align, but we also want to change, we want to be able to change the sequence and kind of randomize it or create our own new sequences out of a single preset. So this is a really powerful technique that I like to use. I generally would do it manually, actually chopping up little loops and putting bits from different loops, that I wanted, and using the scissor tool quite extensively. I like the fact that there's a lot of randomization in how you can pan and reverse the grains in the Granular engine, so you can make the most of a lot of these, maybe a simple loop, you can make it sound like it's a lot longer than it actually is. It kind of evolves and stuff because there's a little bit of this randomization that you can inject into the sound. So anyway, first thing we want to kind of get over is how to actually load up a sample into the Granular engine within Bitwig, because I know a few people are probably struggling with this. You don't do it via the clip window over here, because this is actually a container that contains several audio clips. You have to actually access the audio clip from the bottom window over here, and then you can drag it into any element in Faceplant, whether it's the sampler or the Granular engine. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to try figure out the length of the audio clip. So there are easier ways to do this. However, I want to show you the manual way and then how to actually figure it out using the numbers. So here, what we can do is we can just kind of guesstimate and kind of just time it and watch the project move through the window. Does that make sense? And see, does it align up? So what we want to do here is let's put in one long note in Faceplant, and then what we do, we can mute the audio file, and then let's just see how long it takes this LFO to finish. So you see here, it's already too fast. It's going through 2 cycles. So here what we need to do is set this to 16. There is an easier way to figure out how these numbers actually work. If we look at the grids, we'll see that there's going to be 16 kicks in this sequence here. If we're doing like a 4 on the floor kick, there would be 16 kicks in the sequence. So we can visualize it as blocks of 4, which is this number over here, 16 of those blocks of 4. And where I'm getting at the blocks of 4 is basically these subdivisions. So each 4, there'll be a main division, and there's 16 of those main divisions. So you can actually quickly work this out by knowing how the numbers kind of correlate within Faceplant. I know that this is another thing that confuses quite a lot of people. They kind of wish there was a bar, 1/2, 1/4, that kind of thing. But I like this because it allows you to do slightly polymetric things, but that's for another day. So anyway, now what we can do is we can get this to modulate the sample position. So now what this is going to do is it's going to scrub through the sample kind of progressively as the note plays. So basically it's going to scrub through the loop. But with this, let's actually not assign this yet. Let's push this value through a remap, which we're going to get to a little bit later. But just to save the setup, let's do it through a remap for now, and then assign it to the sample play position. Now we can actually play the sample and see what happens. So you can actually kind of physically hear that there's multiple grains, and we only want one grain. But the kind of magic of this setup that we're going to do is not using this density system, it's using the sync system. And if we set this to 1/8, which was the size of the hits that we programmed in, it's going to loop those hits while it progressively moves through the loop. So it should sound a lot more accurate if we use the sync and set this to the size of each of the hits in the loop that we loaded in. Does that make sense? So the next thing is you can hear there's a kind of amplitude envelope with attack on each of the grains, and that's represented by this grain envelope over here. So if we set this all the way to the beginning, it's going to give us a much more snappier sound, which is what we want with this kind of more percussive sound. Okay, so this is weird. I somehow figured out that the sample that I've loaded in is actually double the size. So it's skipping some of the hits. But this is actually where one of the new features in Faceplant comes in handy. We can open up the sample editor inside the Granular engine and simply just shave off. We're going to snap and shave off these bars at the end here, 4 to 8, by highlighting them and say edit cut. And this just makes the sample half the size. So now this is actually going to track accurately. You can see as this moves along, it moves along to the end, and then moves along back to the beginning over there. Okay, so one thing that I want to set up quickly, because this becomes apparent when you're using it in multiple projects, is I want to set up a envelope size parameter on a macro here. I want to set the macro to bipolar so we can sweep it up or down. And let's just set this up onto this time over here. And let's just call this grain env. Because what might happen is if we speed up the tempo, we might need to just adjust this over here. So you can actually hear it allows us to shorten that envelope, but also lengthen it. But you can hear when you kind of get over a certain point, you can hear that the notes is then overlapping with the next sound, which is technically what we don't want. So just in the preset, being able to fine tune it is something that we want to leave in there. So the next thing we want to get to is the root note. So this sound that I actually rendered in was in F. So what I want to do is I want to set this to any of the Fs. And so now what this allows us to do is actually play it relevant to any particular pitch. So this Faceplant note over here is in C at the moment, but we don't necessarily have to keep it in C. We could play it in F. Does that make sense? So now this gives us the ability to load this preset up into any project, change the tempo, change the key, and we've got something relevant to that particular project, which is very powerful, something that I kind of like to retain within presets. I don't want them to be too project specific. Does that make sense? Okay, so once I get to this point, I want to save a template because I can always fall back to this, or I can load up other sounds and kind of experiment, because this is kind of the main setup. So from here, we can kind of alter it in various different ways. Another thing I actually want to outline, before saving the template, what we want to do is we want to set up this remap so that it snaps to these exact values. That way, it's going to make sure that it's even more on the grid when we do sweep these things. Also, what we could then potentially do is we can randomize those values, and it's always going to snap to a particular part of the grid. So what am I talking about? If we think about this audio file having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, 16, 24, 32 hits, right? What we want to do is we want to divide this remap into 32 steps. So let's set this to 16. For some reason, it's always doubled in Faceplant. Set this to 32. And then what we do is we simply just draw a staircase like this. We want to actually snap it and then make sure that each of the values increments perfectly up like this. So you should end on the value just below 100%. and then you'll see now it's actually snapping to the start points or the onsets of the transients of each of the sounds in the loop. So this is a super powerful technique, very important actually for the granular looper. Now we save as a template. So here's where we can start experimenting with either adding randoms or using this LFO over here as some form of sequencer. We can also start experimenting with these random values over here. So let's say, for example, add some pan and reverse. And so now what's going to happen is each of these sounds is either going to have a kind of randomized pan position and give us some kind of stereo, and it's also going to reverse some of those to give us a kind of more sweep than a percussive sound. And this is really nice because this very simple loop that we've got now is going to kind of constantly sound slightly different because of these randomization values. Okay, so for now I'm going to leave the reverse off just to show you this next part about the sequencer because it's going to be a little bit easier to hear what's going on here. Let's split this again into 32s, and then here it actually doesn't matter. We don't have to snap these values because it's going to be snapped because of that remap. Does that make sense? So we can kind of just go wild and draw in any particular shapes that we want to create these unique sequences. So now what we can do is we can also set up a sequencer that's going to sequence our gate values. So let's just duplicate this to keep the size settings intact. And now what I want to do is I just want to give it either 100% or 0% values. So we can actually just erase all of it, and I'm going to draw some kind of like Euclidean rhythm over here. So give it gap 1, gap 2, gap 1, gap 2, something like this. So now let's add turn the level down to 0% and then add this to this level. So now we've got a sequence. So only sometimes the note is actually going to play, sometimes it's going to be reversed, sometimes it's going to be panned. We're choosing which grain it's sequencing to. So essentially what we're doing here is we're adding a loop of sounds which we know are going to kind of work, and then all we're doing is we're assigning what sound is playing at what time and various different granular parameters. So this is incredibly powerful for these kind of endless grid or one-shot sequences that kind of just evolve throughout your track. Okay, so I'm going to quickly add a little bit of effects here. I'm going to turn to a preset pack that I've actually made for Snap Heap, and then just quickly load up one of the mixing effect here called Lead Source, which just has some delays, reverbs, a shimmer effect, and some other things that I generally use on my leads, just to kind of give this some space in the mix. Oh, that is brilliant. That's brilliant. Okay, so now I want to get into some slightly more advanced stuff. So if you start losing track of what's going on here, don't worry about that. Maybe just come back at a later stage. Once you've built this preset, come back at a later stage, because this kind of thing is not as necessary. What we want to do is we want to be able to create a macro that's going to turn off these sequences over here and instead engage a system of randomization, which is going to play the patch randomly. So the first thing we need to do is set up the actual randoms themselves. So let's set these two up over here, and we want to sync them to the speed of the hits at the moment, which I believe is 2/16. So let's set them both to 2/16. We can also both just set them to unipolar by clicking the plus icon over here, because we don't need the negative values. So firstly, I want to discuss quickly how to set up the gate. Let's set up output through a remap, and then we can actually simply just draw in a square pattern like this. So this is only going to allow values of 100% or 0% through, thus creating a random gate. What we can do is we can actually change the percentage at which it's going to gate by just moving this, the pulse width of the square further to the right or further to the left. So then we set this output to the level. Let's set this to 100% over here. So the trick now is to set up a macro. Let's call this random, or let's call it seq/random. And because on the left it's going to engage the sequencer, on the right it's going to engage the random. So what we can do here is we get this to turn down the gate sequencer and turn up this random, which feeds into that remap. Does that make sense? So this is not controlling the actual sequence. All this is doing now is it's controlling the gate pattern. Check this out. First we have the sequenced pattern, and as I switch it over to the random side, you're going to hear it's going to start randomizing the pattern. That is perfect. Okay, so now let's set up the random that's going to change the actual sequence. So what we want to do is the same parameter over here. Let's set this up to turn down this LFO that feeds into the first remap that we made. And then what we also want to do is we want to get this random to feed into this remap by 1, a value of 1. And then we want that same seek random parameter to adjust the output of this random. And so now we've essentially created the same thing as we did with the gates, but with the actually sequencing what sound is going to trigger. So let's have a listen to this now. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to set up a parameter that can adjust the speed of the entire sequence. So it can change it from a 1/8 to a 1/16. So for that, we're going to need to adjust all of these LFOs and the randoms as well. So a neat feature in FacePlant is you can actually right click over here and change this exact value over here, and it'll work out the percentage that you need. So let's say, for example, we want to change from 1/8 to 1/16. It's going to work out the exact percentage that we need. This is a really, really cool little feature that not a lot of people actually know about. Okay, so then here we want to change this from 16 down to 8. And same thing with all of these. We want them to go from 16 down to 8. And same with the randoms. But here we want to go from 2/16 down to 1/16. I guess it's such a small sweep, it doesn't even work it out as a number. So you wouldn't, I don't think you'd physically be able to actually push that number in there, but you can using this little number over here by just sweeping it that way. Super nifty. So then let's just call this speed Let's see how this works. We can actually get it to also automatically adjust this grain, because when you adjust the speed, it's going to overlap. So we can automatically adjust the grain when the speed goes up so that it just aligns below, do you see that? Below this line, and then it won't overlap. Cool. That's about it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I'm going to be uploading these presets to my Patreon for all my $5 supporters. So if you want to know what that's all about, check out the link in the description. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.